Okay, so today for Open Heritage, we're going to discuss adaptive reuse in terms of governance and community. So some of the questions we might ask is, what is participatory governance? What models do we know? What are some guiding ethical principles? And how to involve different communities in a participatory governance project. So the governance I will be talking about explicitly addresses heritage communities. Heritage community consists of people who value specific aspects of cultural heritage, which they wish within the framework of public action to sustain and transmit to future generations. The governance models featured here for adaptive reuse of cultural heritage are largely based on case study analysis of existing shared governance arrangements for cultural heritage adaptive reuse projects in 16 international cities and regions done through the CLIC project or circular models leveraging investments in cultural heritage adaptive reuse. Nearly all of the 16 case studies are case study examples were publicly owned heritage assets, but in many cases used a variety of multi-actor governance models to realize the project. They found that the majority of cases fell into one of three self-defined custodian governance models: public custodian, community custodian, or private custodian for the common good. As such, there was a choice to cluster and analyze the cases by custodianship, that is, ownership management structure and relationship that defines the entities responsible for the heritage asset and its long-term physical, economic, and cultural sustainability. A public custodian governance model is one in which a public entity, local, regional, or national, entirely owns, manages, finances, and governs the adaptive reuse of a heritage asset. It is important to note that although the public entity plays a central role, the public custodian model does not preclude the involvement of other actors, particularly those in heritage community. A community custodian governance model on the public custodian model inasmuch that a public entity owns the heritage asset, but one or more heritage community actors are responsible for the management and long-term success of the asset. This third sector, community sector partnership, is largely defined by the owner-manager relationship and the degree of autonomy and support, financial and administrative, given to the heritage community actors by the public entity. As such, the community custodian governance model is a spectrum with many governance variations arrayed on its axis. A private custodian for the common good governance model is one in which a private entity collaborates with the public third sector actors to preserve a heritage asset that has a common good. The end goal is to preserve and sustainably use the asset, not to make a profit. Along with analyzing case studies, the CLIC project also developed principles for circular governance. As the world's physical, economic, environmental, and cultural contexts continue to evolve, so must governance around heritage to adapt to new realities. The circular governance approach is not government or a governance module, but a values-based, principled approach for valorizing, protecting, and sustaining cultural heritage assets as a common good for society. This approach specifically addresses the governance of cultural heritage adaptive reuse projects. An alternative approach to cultural heritage governance is needed to preserve and valorize cultural heritage sites in a new and different way, and ultimately in a more inclusive and sustainable manner. This alternative approach requires transparency, openness, and circular processes that engage a broad range of stakeholders to foster inclusive decision-making and shared long-term responsibility for adaptively reusing cultural heritage assets. We will be putting these principles into practice later on when we discuss design justice and our cases. In addition to the circular governance principles, I thought it would be important to mention one of the more important frameworks that we have adopted in Platonique, which is design justice. We often try to implement the principles in our approach in our projects such as Open Heritage. Design justice is a set of 10 principles for more just design. These principles were collaboratively written in the session Generating Shared Principles for Design Justice in the Future Lab Design in the Future Design Lab, a practice space that the Allied Media Conference in Detroit created in 2015. The aim was to approach a shared definition of design justice and some methods of creating a just design practice as distinguished from design with good intentions, which can be harmful, exclusionary, and perpetuate the systems and structures that give rise to the need for design interventions in the first place. Design justice rethinks processes, centers people who are normally marginalized by design, and uses collaborative creative practices to address the deepest challenges of that our communities face. In regard to open heritage, Principle 5, we see the role of the designer as a facilitator rather than an expert. In Principle 6, we believe that everyone is an expert based on their own lived experience, and we all have unique and brilliant contributions to bring to the design process. We're important to our approach in facilitating online spaces for heritage communities. To create online spaces, we did some research on existing platforms for participation and decided on Decidim. So in this aspect, we're actually entering into how we take heritage governance online. So to start, what is Decidim? Decidim is a free open source participatory democracy platform for cities and organizations. But Decidim is more than a digital platform. It's a free and open project with a larger infrastructure involving code, documentation, design, training courses, a legal framework, collaborative interfaces, and a common vision. Decidim was created to be an adaptive digital space where various tools, modules, and components can be built according to a community or organization's need to create democratic participatory processes. As one such as as such, one can create assemblies, consultations, or events with various participatory activities that have a digital translation, i.e., you can create an assembly on the platform, record your meetings there, and, for example, create a space for proposal making. Participants can create proposals, upvote them, endorse them, or comment on them. The idea is that these activities are based on activities normally associated with a collaborative decision-making process, which is not necessarily possible via Facebook, Twitter, Slack. You would have to creatively reform these features to reproduce the same activity. So who is currently using Decidim? It is currently used by cities and organizations. Decidim is being used all over the world by various organizations, and more notably by public entities, to facilitate participation with multiple stakeholders, especially residents and citizens. Decidim was a platform the Open Heritage Labs used to facilitate their heritage projects. And so what can a participant or user of Decidim do? Decidim makes it possible for thousands of people to organize themselves democratically by making proposals, attending public meetings, fostering decision-making discussions, deciding through different forms of voting, and monitoring the implementation of decisions. And finally, more than just a piece of software, Decidim has a social contract. The Decidim social contract is a code of democratic practices that guarantees democratic collaboration. All members of the MetaDecidim open source community must endorse the social contract committed to transparency, traceability, and accountability. So, what is digital governance and heritage? We've discussed what is Decidim, but how does governance in real life bridge with digital governance? Well, digital governance is a framework for establishing accountability, roles, and decision-making authority for an organization's digital presence. Digital governance differs from the modules shown earlier in that digital governance refers to data, processes, and content created online through an organization, whether it be municipality or citizen association. Decidim fits into this niche because it enables the possibility of creating a governance structure that encapsulates both physical and digital processes of governance in heritage. Governance procedures, whether internal or external, whether the framework and roles of the online or offline, can be hosted, recorded, and accounted for in Decidim. Digital governance does not change the structural nature of how people, places, and things are governed, but it shifts it online whereas a result digital participants, places, and things will also need to be accounted for. So, here we have challenges to participatory governance. On the far left-hand side, we have The challenge, the center are the solutions for innovations as highlighted by the CLICK study. And finally, we have some approaches we used in our work addressing digital governance and communities. So as you can see, there are some ways in which the digital can facilitate governance practices and structures. Here, a digital governance approach can create accessible information and go beyond just creating a page or blog, but to think about audios and podcasts or videos to help people understand and access knowledge in different in different ways and respect people's different people's capacities to learn with different tools. Here we have challenges in terms of transparency and accountability. Unclear selection criteria for choosing projects or poor communication can be elucidated using platforms to show how voting was done and creating accessible communications from creating a blog or hosting and broadcasting your meeting. Another challenge to collaborative aspects of governance is the demand of diverse interests and long bureaucratic and political governance processes. So diverse interests can be managed perhaps through creating more transparency and record keeping and using digital tools to help keep record and share who is making decisions and how. However, what digital platforms cannot do is cut through bureaucratic red tape. And finally, in terms of challenges to circular participatory governance, there's an over-reliance on volunteerism and often the inability to be self-sufficient in terms of financing. So in terms of relying on volunteers, the CIDIM allows to record and track hours of different volunteers. This can help you make a case for looking for paid labor and funding. Or they can also make the case for seeking out support from your local municipality by showing just how much work goes into sustaining your heritage site. And finally, for financial self-sufficiency, there are several methods online that have gone into funding government heritage projects such as crowdfunding, campaigning, and so on with platforms such as Goteo or Kickstarter. And finally, one challenge to participatory governance are the fair and just aspects. So the privatization of heritage assets or the lack of transparency and comprehensive indicators. There are few transparent and comprehensive indicators to measure a variety of impacts to, for example, community health and well-being. Well, to address the first, some of the methods that have been used to address privatizing heritage assets online are organizing campaigns for participatory processes to amplify and raise awareness about what's going on, to solicit the participation of more public stakeholders. And also the lack of transparency and comprehensive indicators. Kanbatyo has famously used the internet from Twitter to Decidim to demonstrate public support and demand for transparency and action from the municipality to safeguard its neighborhood against gentrification. So there are multiple ways to amplify your message and create more transparent governance practices using digital platforms such as Decidim. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time and I hope this was informative.